Thanks for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. So look, I think rather than like me going through and introducing everybody, I'd just give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. And then we'll take a little bit of time to, I'll ask some questions of the panelists, but really the reason we put this panel together is because it represents folks that are coming from many different aspects, both sort of like vertically and horizontally within international development and foreign assistance, including everything from the strategy and policy level to implementation, and including both from the US government and the private and not-for-profit sectors. So Jason, I'll let you go first. I think you guys might.
I speak into your...
I think we'll have to share some mics.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jason Ladnier. I'm currently Interagency Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, working on stabilization and security issues. I belong to the U.S. Department of State's Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. I've been there since 2006, working on a range of issues, including monitoring, evaluation, strategic planning. Served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary over our Middle East, Latin America, and Europe efforts. Before that, I was with the Fund for Peace for 6 years, working on what became the Foreign Policy's Failed State Index.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Andresen. I work at USAID OFTA. I'm the team leader that's responsible for working with the humanitarian protection team, the monitoring and evaluation team, the disaster assessment technology and analytics team, and as well as the information humanitarian coordination teams. Before joining OFTA, I was mostly in the field in Central Africa and Central Asia, working on protection and monitoring and evaluation issues. Oops, you have one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aisha Kasali. I'm a Global Health Fellow with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I currently work with the foundation capacity of the strategy data analytics team, really supporting them in terms of the innovative tools and platforms that the foundation is working on in the data space. And prior to that, I was working in Nigeria as a public health physician, and also did some monitoring and evaluation work in maternal and neonatal child health, and also started a healthcare technology company in Nigeria prior to joining the foundation.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Sawyer Baker, and I have the privilege of serving the 211 network via my position at United Way Worldwide. The 211 network is comprised of over 200 organizations, many of which are local United Ways, and many of which are also independent nonprofits, and they serve about 95% of the U.S. 211 is a vital service leveraged by millions across North America every year, and every day clients reach out to 211 to access free and confidential services like getting housing and financial assistance, utilities assistance, veteran services, family services, you name it. And coming to this panel, the perspective I bring is every call for help is a data point. And so what do you do with that data to better inform advocacy, program, service provision, et cetera? So excited to be here. Thank you.
Cool. I might actually go with you first then, Sawyer. I mean, this question is going to be for everybody, but you've teed it up really nicely. I mean, part of what we look to do in structuring this panel was look at folks who've really leveraged technology and data for decision making in their own sort of prospective environment. So could you talk a little bit about like what it means for every call to be a data point and how you all think about leveraging that data and maybe other data sources?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, as I said, millions of people call 211 or interact with them via text every year. And when someone calls and makes that call for help, they're presenting with maybe one need or multiple needs. And 211s have been operating locally for years. And so for us, we would like to get to a point where all of that data is rolled up in an aggregate space where we can overlay different data sets on top of it to be more predictive with those analytics to either drive investments in communities, whether to drive policy. You know, is there a space where we can be more predictive in that space rather just responding to the call for help? And when we get there, is there a way to show the intersecting needs of people in order to give them a better system of care and better coordinated care? So for us, we have a lot of data. It's what do we do with it and how do we enter this space in a way that's helpful to our clients, but also our partners in our communities as well.
Same question for you, Aisha. How do you guys think about this issue at the Gates Foundation, especially where you're funding lots of different activities at once?
Yeah, so at the foundation, data is viewed as a cross-cutting tool, an enabler, and it's a really important part of most of our strategic priorities and programmatic tools. So we go about ensuring that, we leverage all of the different partners and walk across really the entire data value chain, from the data collection to its analysis, but most importantly, making sure that we use innovative tools and platforms to ensure that data is available and accessible for use, especially most in the developing world, which we work mostly in. So ensuring that there are platforms in place that makes that data accessible for everyone to access and can make informed decisions, especially at the policy level.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. As a bit of a spoiler alert, my notes for the panel are handwritten, so I might be bringing more of a bit of a Luddite approach. That was intended to be a joke. Anyway, so how OFTA really views data and how we use it in decision making, I just wanted to make 2 points on this. As a humanitarian donor, our first priority is doing no harm. So any consideration, any new tool, any analytic software, any sharing of data has to go through the screen of, will this harm or threaten any of the populations or specific individuals that we are employed to serve, with our mandate of saving lives and reducing human suffering. So with that background, I think one of the important things that's happened for us in the past 5 years is the grand bargain commitments around joint needs assessments and around the participation revolution. This has pushed the humanitarian community, which has been perhaps on the more Luddite end of the spectrum, to really try to address how are we using data in our strategies, how are we using data to show our work, how are we really prioritizing, monitoring, and evaluation, and how are we moving from only relying on expertise to make decisions, a little bit more moving towards how are we integrating evidence. So we are not as far along, but for a lot of reasons, which I'll talk about in a second.
So I think there's a trend line here. So for my last 13 years of my career, I've been working as part of the State Department. Our organization has been the conflict prevention and conflict stabilization subject matter experts within an organization that values generalists. And so while those within USAID and the expertise that supports USAID work, there's a real cultural value for technical expertise and subject matter experts. And so what we're trying to do is meet our decision makers, the diplomats, the political appointees, the policymakers, to meet them where they are and to figure out the questions that they're trying to ask, to inform the decisions they need to make, and then work from there, what information, what data is useful to informing those decisions. And so it's something that we have to be creative in that, and we also have to realize that there is a default by your traditional diplomat to trust her or his gut. And so the question is, how do you bring data to tell compelling stories that, because if you contradict that, they may dismiss it. If it agrees with them, they may say, well, I already knew that, so what's the value? So we've been trying to look at ways to project out in the future and tell compelling stories about future pathways. And then you have a relationship, and then 3, 6, 9 months down the road, you can say, look what played out. And so it's really building that relationship of trust to inform decision makers as they're trying to figure out the risks of various policy decisions. And it's the challenge that we have lots of data that tells us that every single project or program was successful, but we have very little going into the channels of what's the big so what impact. Did we achieve our overarching strategic goals in a place? And so that's the hard part and the part that really requires thinking about how decision makers process information.
If I can ask you a quick follow-up on it, because you gave me a good question. I mean, the State Department, is predominantly a policy-making organization, but then still has certain departments that are also implementing programs. What do you see as like the differences in how you try to serve those two different types of consumers, I guess would be one way to put it?
Yeah, I think this is something that frequently people say, State, you're the policy folks, and aid does implementation. That forgets that diplomacy is actually an action, that the relationships that are built both at the capital level but also down at the subnational level, that's operations. And so really figuring out, coming back to the data conversation, how do you turn relationships, networks, influence, how do you turn that into data that you can then map and then you can show trends over time? And so that's something that there's network analysis tools out there, there's modeling on the influence of different actors over time. Those are the things that can be useful to a diplomat, because at the end of the day, they're trying to figure out, with limited bandwidth, who are the key relationships that we need to advance our policy goals.
Thanks. That's good. All right, so I've got some specific questions for each of you. I'll go ahead and head back down the line again and keep you all on your toes. So, Sawyer, we were hoping you could maybe dig into a little bit about some of the practical uses of data that you all are collecting. And one of the things I noticed is you talked a lot about both preparing for a response, the use of data during a response, and then how that affects post-response. And so there's sort of like a data pipeline there, if you will, right? How do you guys think about those challenges?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, sometimes people call, and oftentimes people call 211 for assistance, for disaster assistance before, during, and after a disaster. And especially when governors put out that message, or local emergency response agencies or the news put that out, it generates a lot of data about what people might need during disasters. And so after the 2017 hurricane season, we looked at what were people calling 211 about, and when they were calling about those needs. And what we identified is there were very, what I would say, more simple questions, like where's the nearest shelter, to more complex needs, like my grandmother's on dialysis and we've been told to evacuate, what do we do? And so we knew there must be a way to somehow have a new channel to interact with clients who were calling and asking these questions. And so with the help of IBM, we have used their Carla technology to create an AI chatbot that responds to simple questions like, where is the nearest shelter? That's enabled us to have surge capacity, which is something, we don't have the luxury of hiring trained 211 call specialists for 2-week stints when a disaster hits. So we're either going to acknowledge that we can't keep up with demand and find a technology solution to help, or we'll continue to have the issue hurricane after hurricane. So we do have this AI chatbot that's all data-driven. The training for it came from real text conversations that people were having with people. So it's very well trained, and we've been able to use it in 2 hurricanes thus far, Michael and Dorian. We have one developed for Florida and for Louisiana. I would say the Louisiana chatbot we have not used yet, which is a good thing, which means that a hurricane has not hit recently. But the beauty with the Louisiana chatbot is it is county specific. So you can ask it, where will sandbags be for each one of the 60 parishes in Louisiana, and it'll have an answer. And of course, we can talk more about what that means to maintain that sort of data set, but really it was a data-driven decision to use the technology. It was a data-driven decision to use it to train the bot, and then obviously, executing on that.
Well, one of the things that, sorry, I'm going to follow up because you said something super interesting, but one of the things that I often think about is that increased use of data for decision making when you implement programs is going to result in programs that are significantly more differentiated at a local level. And I heard you say 2 things. One, in some ways you're sort of like segmenting or cohorting people who have texted into those with simplified needs that we can provide more automated responses for, and then those who may have more complex needs. And then the second, being able to segment that population geospatially so that they're getting the right answer relative to where they are. But so I think now that you have that data and you're able to resolve that inference, the question is, how are you prepared to tailor your actual responses to that? So have you guys had to think very much about like the then, services that you might provide and how they can be adapted to deal with a population for which you have, data that allows you to differentiate them?
Yeah, so every time someone interacts with the bot or interacts with our call specialist, right, it's generating the data, and that can help inform at what point maybe in the bot's life of being deployed, we have really easy click buttons where people can click like, I want information about a shelter, like they don't even need to type it in, and data is driving what those buttons will be for easier service delivery during a disaster. I will say that the AI technology, it won't go rogue and provide a response that isn't pre-approved at all. These are things, we're very wanting to make sure that no disinformation is going out, obviously, during a disaster. And so these are pre-approved. But on the back end, we can see things that we hadn't thought of that people might be asking. For example, during Dorian, someone asked if they should tie their camper down to our chatbot. Carla came back with I'm sorry, I can't help, but please call 211. And so, when we see that data, we can reflect on, like we hadn't yet considered that, which makes it a better service provision for everyone interacting with the bot.
So I think I can say this because I'm from West Virginia. Do you have to train it all to like nuances in the language or the vernacular of a place like Louisiana over somewhere else?
Oh, for sure. There was a whole discussion about y'all when we were developing the Louisiana bot. But it's an interesting point you raise. When you talk about risks of different technologies, that's one of them. Making sure it's trained in a diverse way so everyone is getting the same level of service provision. Training it to understand slang or the way people talk is important because if the bot can't learn, it's going to result in a non-response. And so training it with real-world questions and having diverse trainers with different backgrounds who are asking the bot, it's very important to have that piece for sure.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to prime this question for you a little bit, Aisha. Unbeknownst to you, but I was having a conversation a little bit earlier today about the challenge of creating this new world when we have multiple actors that are involved in a response or in providing a particular service. So like if you use HIV, for example, there's a couple different parts of the US government, there's the Global Fund, et cetera. And so, unlike in the private sector, one of those is not trying to put the other out of business, right? Like the idea is for us to all work together. And, I understand that the Gates Foundation has done a lot of work in creating these global goods that are data sources that can be used by everyone across the community. And so I'm curious sort of like, one, how you think about addressing that challenge, but also, how do you then drive utilization of that data, and so it doesn't just sit there. Like I think and you probably deal with this some as well with the humanitarian data exchange, right? So
yeah, I feel the way the foundation approaches this, and one of the super interesting things about the developing world is the paucity of data, and one of the rewarding things that the foundation has invested is, for example, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, and really helping to create that evidence-based database that can pull together information and create these amazing data visualizations that people can actually reach out to and find information that can be useful for decision making. And it's interesting because another comparative advantage that the foundation has in terms of what you said, pulling together all of these partners, is really the trust that we've been able to create with our partners, working with governments, with the private sector. For example, what we've been working on, crowdsourcing with Premise and the Lagos State Ministry of Health. But in terms of creating processes that people find useful and are able to utilize, or platforms that people utilize that are not just sitting there, it's really that initial openness and trust and relationship that you create with the partner. So most of our governmental partners really find it beneficial, because when we go to them with a new tool, we're not saying, oh, this is the next big thing for you to catch on to, but rather sitting with them and trying to understand what are the problems, what are the challenges, and how can we better, help or provide tools that can help you solve some of these challenges, and then figuring it out together. So it's always that posture of, we don't have all the answers. We're all experimenting. We're all trying to figure out how will this work, and how will this be of an advantage. And then so that kind of brings down the defense, and then people are more open to try out new things. They're more open to access these platforms and see that, oh, this can be useful in our decision making. So that's, I think, a really critical or integral part that most development partners have to consider in terms of the governments or the partners that you're working with, and understanding that being the recipient of aid can actually also be difficult. And you're sitting there and somebody's telling you, you have it all figured wrong. So there's always that initial kind of pushback, like, oh, what do you mean? So just that, creating that sense of trust and initial relationship is really critical to ensure that all of that data is kind of used to make this meaningful decisions, which is our end goal, by the way. But we're trying to ensure that policymakers use all of these amazing data points to make decisions that makes their programs or plans successful at the end of the day.
So you brought up something that I realize a lot of what we've talked about today has been sort of the relationship between donors and funding agencies and the private sector, but I think the Institute for Health Metrics is run at the University of Washington, right? So what do you think about the role of universities and research institutions in how we use data for things that aren't always research, that are actually much more practical, like implementation of projects?
Yeah, the academic world is really, really critical, because there's a pool of talent and knowledge and all of this wonderful people that have done a lot of amazing research. Sometimes it might be removed from the ground and removed from the field, but that's where the partnership comes in terms of bringing your expertise and bringing the knowledge and bringing all of the tools that you have available, and try to tie it in with implementing partners and say, okay, we have all of these ideas, we have all of these visualizations and tools that we use in the developed world. How can we better translate that to the developing world? How can we kind of marry all of those, the problems and then the solutions that we're bringing in, and make it more meaningful to the people that we're portraying this to? Thanks.
That's good. All right, Caroline. So I recently just got back from Colombia, actually, and Colombia is dealing with the Venezuela crisis almost as much as Venezuela is. And one of the things that really strikes me about a humanitarian crisis is that, Deputy Glick was saying earlier, especially in a humanitarian crisis, it's not like the U.S. government is responsible for all of this, right? Like, the UN's involvement is huge. And so I was wondering if you could touch on some of the issues of using, a shared sense of what's happening in the world, made up of data, to coordinate, the actors of multiple people at once, and also address some of those issues of, like, is it okay for everyone to have all of that data, right?
Certainly. I guess to start off, I would ask everyone to open up their folders. Yes. And there is a piece of paper in there about Syria that I would ask you to please pull out. And I would ask you to leave it on the table. And one of our colleagues will be coming around to pick it up. There is information on there that is not appropriate for anyone outside of OFTA, and does present a risk to our beneficiaries and the populations we're trying to serve. The piece of paper is in about a quarter of the binders, so if you could please look at your binders and take out that Syria information. So that's actually related to your second question.
Yeah.
I would really like to talk about two things. the importance of data protection and privacy, and then the importance of looking at a system and a foundation before you look at an app. So where I sit, and where a lot of my colleagues at OFTA and I believe Food for Peace as well, we are first and foremost, as I mentioned before, concerned with doing no harm to our beneficiaries. The reason why I somewhat awkwardly asked everyone to open their folders and take out that piece of paper is that the consequences for getting this wrong is the loss of life. One of the most frightening, two of the most frightening experiences I've had in my career is when we got data privacy wrong and we thought we lost an enumerator. So the consequence isn't a bad news story. It's not a policy decision going the wrong way. It's our beneficiaries and our staff dying. So that is the first test that, and really the only test for us that matters. And it is when we think about data, when we think about analytics, when we think about a new shiny object tool to try, the first thing humanitarians are obviously thinking about is how will this kill anyone? And some solutions and some shiny objects could kill people. So the second point I want to try to emphasize here is you hear for a while, oh, there's an app for that. That's wonderful. Do you have a plan for the use of the data? Do you have a plan for how, who the users are, what decisions it will inform, what methods will be used to gather the data? Do you know how we're going to protect the life of a respondents and how this will affect our larger humanitarian response? And the answer to that question, when we get either pressured to use a new technology or we are told that the answer to this grand humanitarian problem is this app, we are commonly in the position of having to push back to say, let's go back to the foundation. What decision are we trying to make here? And what data do you need to inform that decision? And only after what can be months and months of discussion around the safety of our beneficiaries and the safety of our staff and the safety of our implementing partners, do we then consider, would an app be the correct method? Would a data solution be the solution that is appropriate, safe, and feasible for this? So we do a lot of pushback, and it's not because we do not want to get along with the rest of our colleagues in USAID or other donors, but it's because we are pretty singularly focused on making sure that we're not doing harm. We're not getting anyone hurt, injured, or killed as a result of an app. The last point I do want to make is because we are so rightfully focused on the safety of our beneficiaries and sometimes do feel inundated with suggested solutions of apps, we have a pretty natural barrier. So we will keep a lot of solutions at arm's length because we've had years of experience of colleagues suggesting solutions that do put our beneficiaries at risk. And so that has created a pretty, at times a tough culture, and being afraid, I think, of data at times. So my push to my colleagues in OFTA and in Food for Peace is once you've done your homework, don't be afraid of the app. We do a lot of work figuring out what the right design is, what the right foundation is. But then once that solution has been identified as an app or a software that has been developed in the past 5 years, don't be afraid to use it. There are so many efficiency gaps that could be filled with the better utilization of software, particularly around analytics, around specific applications that are tailored to the humanitarian context, that we need to be much more welcoming to those solutions once it has all been tested and has been, we've made sure that it's not harming anyone.
You just drop the mic if you want. That was powerful. Thanks. Sticking with an adjacent topic that includes sensitivity of data, but I think, to my understanding, some of the work that you've done at CSO, Jason, involves trying to use data to understand something that's super hard to measure. And that probably goes for a lot of other policy areas as well. How do you guys think about addressing that challenge when something is way less straightforward than understanding the percentage of a birth cohort that got immunized, where we sort of know how to measure it?
Yeah, this is something that we're still trying to figure out. It's important to remember that the system, our stewardship of taxpayer dollars, requires a lot of collection and reporting of data. That's not going to change, and so you set that to one side, and then there's the data that you collect to help you think through the problem as you're a year into a stabilization mission or 5 years into a stabilization mission. And for that to work, you have to have the decision-making processes set up to receive that. And there's a lot of talk about what's the proxy indicator, and people are oftentimes looking for the silver bullet. And I remember the price of AK-47s at one time, the size of weddings in Pakistan, those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, if that particular indicator or piece of data isn't wrapped in a theory of how this place works, what's the politics of this place, what's the society dynamics of the place, then it's just going to have the chance to mislead people. And so I think in the realm, whether it be fragility, conflict prevention, or stabilization, we're identifying a couple of really key challenges, whether it be issues of legitimacy, marginalization, predatory security services, illicit power structures. And the question is, how do you create constellations of data that allow you to really bounce a number of different data sets off each other to really not get captured by one? Because there's going to invariably be bias. People are telling, if it's a polling or survey, people are answering ways to keep themselves safe, to influence certain assistance pipelines. And so it's really more about how do you create an understanding of what you're trying to do, identify those key challenges, and then really push for as many different angles on that problem, and then kind of bounce them off each other. But if you don't walk into it with the fact that we're thinking through this problem as we do it, that we haven't figured it out, if you don't have that starting point, it's going to be a lot harder to do, because at the end of the day, there's domestic pressures to say we succeeded, to say we're almost done, and those things are real. And so the question is, how do you balance that with a really clear understanding of how complex these things are?
How do you think about, because you named some data sources that sometimes you might be primarily collecting, or some that might exist already but were for a different purpose. How do you think about trying to analyze, determining that you need to collect some specific data versus trying to use stuff that exists, especially if you're looking at proxy indicators of what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tension, because the folks that geek out on the data are excited about new opportunities for data, but 20 years of trying to build robust performance management systems on these types of issues, they tend to get built and then the system moves on. And so while it may not sound as sexy or as cutting edge, but to start really where the decision makers' needs are and then prioritize that, and then, and it's been said before, look at the decisions that need to be made and then go hunt around. Is the data already being collected? That's a plus. That's where you can start. But if it needs to be collected, the folks in the field have to know what they're being told not to do, right? There's always a trade-off. Collect more information, report more information, then they'll say, well, what do you want me not to do? And having that appreciation of their real constraints in their time is super important. I want to piggyback on a conversation you were having with Aisha about data that comes from a public good or public place. And one thing we've tried to do is partner with the folks that do the armed conflict event location data. And because it helps us all to be able to have some agreed understanding of who's committing what violence against whom in what locations at a very, very local level. And so that's the type of thing that it doesn't necessarily help us to keep that just within the U.S. government, because we want to discuss those trends and those issues with our bilateral partners, with host government and host society partners. And so having something that's a public good that's out there that people can say, hey, how can we improve this together? Those are the types of things that I think a lot of the work needs to be the foundation for us to take it to the next level.
One last quick one for you, because you brought it up. I mean, one of the things that struck me in Colombia is there's a lot of argument over what numbers or whose numbers you can release in terms of how many Venezuelan IDPs are there. And so I think one really big challenge the State Department has had is, like, we have to negotiate something that also makes sense for the government of Colombia here, and we all have to agree on how we're going to do this. How do you think about that from like a diplomatic perspective? Doesn't have to be about Colombia specifically, but yeah.
I think at the end of the day, everything that comes out of diplomats' mouth is in service of U.S. foreign policy interests. So I think, again, there are different purposes. Some data is to send a message and to be persuasive, and it depends on the audience. And then there's got to be the data and the information that you use to really figure out if we're doing the right thing, are we being successful. So at some point, the key is just not to get confused. Know which conversation you're having, knowing that you're using particular information with a particular perspective to be persuasive, and then have another place where you have the conversation about what's really going on and how do we achieve what we're trying to do there.
So you're telling me humans still have to be involved in this? Yeah.
Or at least two different robots sitting in different rooms.
Perfect. I ran a little bit over on my questions, and I don't want to rob the audience of the chance to ask a couple. So if you don't mind, I'm going to skip the last one we talked about and open it up. Again, there are mics around the room, and don't be shy.
I'm coming.
Hi, Oliver Quast from Social Impact Partners. I was wondering if you have thought of the use of data to unlock new financial mechanisms that are out there. So instead of, very often the development and humanitarian aid depends on donations, and we could really use other things like insurance, impact bonds, cat bonds, and whatever all of these need, they need some objective, third-party, reliable and measurable data to then define when a certain payout results. And what could be done, for example, is, you anticipate famine, you anticipate a conflict, but what is very often missing is that very good and reliable data to say a conflict will most likely arise in 3 months, and that is because our data has proven in the past that this was the case, and this will most likely result. And if you manage to do that, all of a sudden you have financially motivated investors maybe who would then pay out, and this money can be used to finance refugee tents or whatever you might need. Just wondering if that's something you have thought about.
And were you directing that at anyone in particular?
Probably the conflict one to Jason, but it's for everyone, I think.
I might ask you to also answer, Aisha, because I know the Gates Foundation has looked at some of this for insurance specifically.
I'm trying to make sure I understood your question, because it almost sounded like letting the private sector know that we have a strong belief that conflict will not unfold for a few months, and they can use that period to make some money, and that money goes into good.
That would be a pre-agreed thing. So you would tell the private sector beforehand, if our data says that a conflict will arise, so if a certain threshold is triggered, then a payout results. So all of a sudden, once your data says that most likely a conflict will result in the next couple of months, the private sector pays you whatever $50 million, and you have that money available before the actual conflict even comes up to deal with the potential consequences, to help people before it actually happens.
So this may take your question a different way. I mean, and this does not apply to the humanitarian sector or the health sector. This is purely on the conflict sector. What we've seen over the last few decades is that more resources doesn't necessarily equal more success. And so I think it's more about what are we trying to achieve in the place? Do we have the right partnerships? Do we understand the place well enough? That was a big takeaway from this stabilization assistance review. And so I'm almost kind of pushing back on the notion that it's necessary that we need that injection of private sector cash. But I think 2 other points. I mean, the biggest predictor of conflict in the next month is conflict in the previous month, and so there's a sense of that. But what we also have seen in a number of fields, particularly the atrocity prevention field, is that these types of outbursts of violence are very opportunistic. The folks looking to commit these things don't necessarily have a full plan month by month. They're looking for opportunities, and it becomes very dynamic, and they become, and so that's hard to predict. You can tell a country is likely to have a certain type of violence in the near future, but because these actors are looking for windows and they're looking for opportunities to kind of test the water, will the international community respond? Will they sanction them for activities? That kind of the fidelity down to the day or week or month is hard to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, but in terms of using data, especially to preempt conflict, like you said, one thing that is critical to understand is that data is not just a precision tool, it's a political tool. And in most of the geographies that we work in underserved areas, war-torn areas, people can, be incentivized to use data, in a negative way. So you have to be really careful in terms of how do you monitor the kind of people that you get engaged or involved with, or the kind of conversations that you have, understanding that the data can determine who gets what, where the resources are directed, and then that can lead to some, inimical kind of motivations. So I think that would just be my comment on that.
I think we could probably do at least one more.
Mike Klein, IMC Worldwide. So rightly or wrongly, there's a perception in the industry that innovation or movement to digital is equal to a increase in risk, data leaks, what have you. And we've seen as well, there's a underestimation in how current approaches, analog or what have you, underestimation of the risk of leaks there as well. So, for instance, there was a photo of that was recently tweeted out with contact details of a person, a beneficiary for UNHCR, and that was someone's digital information. I mean, it was digitally released via Twitter, but it was analog, in that it was a card. And I mean, how do you balance kind of the known risks that are inherent in what we do, that are, say, analog, with this perception that in doing it differently or digital, we're increasing the risk at the same time?
That's a good question. It's a good point as well, that there's an assumption that analog isn't dangerous. Analog is, or can be, if it is misused. I would argue that the transforming data collection and moving out of an analog approach just increases, I would say, the speed of data, and increases exponentially the number of people who would have access to it. So while the individual threat to the beneficiary may be similar between analog and digital, I would argue that the scale of the threat is larger with a digital approach. That doesn't mean, though, that that if you're taking an analog approach, you don't have to pay attention to those type of issues. I think when we were looking at revising our proposal guidelines a couple of years ago, one of the things we really paid attention to was in the accountability to affected populations section, how we really ensure that we are either if it's a digital method or if it is an analog method, and also in our revisions to the monitoring and evaluation section, that we are, regardless of the type of method, putting the do no harm approach at the center of every approach that we take.
Thanks. And I'll also just add to that, the 211 network was analog. People used to pull out a resource directory for a community and set it on the desk and answer the phone and go through it and get people connected to services. And while we did come from an analog space, as we move into the digital area, obviously data protection is a huge piece for us. Obviously all the data that we're using to inform our decisions is anonymized, and making sure that that's very clear. But there are risks that come with it, versus a human talking on the phone with another human or using a chatbot to interact with a client. The risks are always, how do we do no harm, but also provide a greater level of access to more people? And so for us, it was really important that in developing the technologies that the client felt supported the entire way, whether it be diverting them to call 211 if they didn't get their question answered, or simply calling 911 in some cases, depending on what their need was. But yeah, there's a lot of gamut there with the risks. So I just wanted to say we came from a very analog space, as many other organizations did as well. And so it's a new space for everyone. And so having champions that understand these issues and getting out in front of it early is very important.
Perfect. I think that's
Okay,
the time,
I
right,
think we're
Ted?
ready to
Yeah.
move. Thank
Cool.
you, guys.
Thank you all. Big round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.